Good afternoon. Go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Carl Blythe. I'm the director of TLTC. That's the acronym TLTC for Texas Language Technology Center. And thank you all for showing up on a Friday, beautiful Friday afternoon. Before I forget, after the talk, Steve would like to talk to more. Steve likes to talk, as you're going to find out, and he wants to keep this going. And so we'll keep it going in the Cactus Cafe. Do you all know where that is in the Union? Okay, so after the talk, we can just all kind of stand up and move en masse to the Cactus Cafe. So this is our last lecture in the TLTC series on CMC, computer-mediated communication and language learning. And I'm really happy to have Stephen Thorne join us and be our last speaker and to kind of wrap things up. But before I introduce Steve, I have something else to introduce, and that is a workshop. This is our last lecture, but we're going to have a workshop in 2 weeks. That's April 10th, so mark your calendars. Same place, so the basement, all those poor people who are wandering around this building, here at 4 o'clock. So same time, same place in 2 weeks. And the workshop is entitled A Virtual World Language Learning and Collaboration Platform, Second Life. And it will be hosted by Leslie Jarman. Leslie, yeah, there she is. Who gives these workshops and faculty and students all around UT. And let me just read part of her blurb about Second Life. She writes, it's a customized introduction to the online 3D virtual world environment of Second Life. Media hype aside, I guess there's been media hype with Second Life. Media hype aside, Second Life is not a game, but an inherently social space with extensive human activity that includes the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Some 300 universities and educational institutions, as well as corporate entities such as IBM, Dell, and AMD, have a virtual presence in Second Life where residents can conduct research, create data visualizations and models, teach and attend classes, conduct business, engage in commerce, etc., etc. Language teachers, and this is the important point for us, language teachers and learners have moved into Second Life en masse, just like what we're going to do, going over to the cafe afterwards, and have begun teaching classes, creating immersive environments, conducting research, convening international conferences, and publishing. So you'll have a kind of an experience, hopefully, with this workshop. She's not just going to talk about Second Life. We will be in Second Life. I hope, and we'll get to fly, I hope.
You'll see some people flying.
Yes, okay. Good. Okay, so the point will be, of course, a Second Life workshop for language teachers talking about how Second Life is now a multilingual, multicultural space, right? Okay. And she also notes that, real quickly, some of the things, the benefits are, it encourages innovation through effective collaboration, discovery learning, accelerates learning of individuals and teams, cultivate more inclusive knowledge-sharing communities, and reduces brick-and-mortar cost of operations. So 2 weeks from today, same place, same time. Okay, which brings me then to our speaker today, Stephen Thorne. And as you can see, he's coming to us from Penn State University Department of Applied Linguistics. He's an assistant professor in applied linguistics and the associate director of the Center for Language Acquisition, which is a Title VI center. And in particular, his research is focusing on emerging technologies and the application to language learning, which of course is his talk today. But as you notice, if you don't know what semiotic flows and bricolage, the main idea is ideas, I guess to say, semiosis and the whole meaning-making process. And he's very good at making meaning. He'll make lots of meanings. A lot of ideas will pop out of his head because he is a master bricoleur. And you're going to find out, I hope, what that means. So without further ado, Stephen Thorne.
First, thanks so much for the invitation, Carl Blythe and others of you associated with TLTC, as I have come to call it, as opposed to TLTC, or the Texas Language Technology Consortium. Center?
Center.
Center. You're not a consortium. You're a
No.
center. And now you can see why I regressed to TLTC, because I can get it right. So it is really quite remarkable to me that you chose to be here on a Friday, because it is glorious outside, especially when you're coming from central Pennsylvania, which is where it is not glorious. at least not this time of year. But we'll talk today about some of these issues, semiotic flows, bricolage, and critical language awareness. And as has been the case for me quite often, when Carl asked me to propose something a few months ago, I had a very clear idea, and in fact developed a talk that was precisely this title. I've had a very interesting 3-ish weeks since I was here actually giving a talk in the FLE program earlier in the month. And so one of the projects that was one of 4 projects has massively expanded to become one of 2 projects, and in fact the primary project. So the neat thing, for me anyway, is that this is fresh, hot, exciting, dynamic, new material that will be hopefully exciting, dynamic, hot, new, fresh, and exciting to you all as well. So let's talk about a preamble, if you will. And let's welcome the last person to come in through that door, maybe. Scoot on in. And this is, I'd like to start off with a couple of pedagogical comments, right, that I'd like to have you keep in mind as we go over some of what we want to talk about today. And this is that, at least from my framework, cultural historical activity theory, but more broadly thinking about cognition and language relations, we as educators are, from the information ecology perspective, the keystone species. We are critical to the functioning of the information ecology that makes up educational settings, right? And so this work is, I think, very, very important. And as engineers of these situations, the social material conditions where we can inculcate the possibilities for learning, but not make people learn. Learning is not a vicarious experience, right? You know, the onus is really on us to do as much as we can. And there are some problems in formal education. And I'm going to talk about, since she's here, especially my Diane Schallert moment a little bit later in the presentation. Earlier in the month, we had an interesting conversation just before I gave my talk. It was the night before. And it caused me to revisit some things, particularly in relationship to Jim G's talk. How many of you attended Jim G's talk? Excellent. So this will not be a contestation of some of the ideas that Jim brought up, but rather a revisioning of the problems that he brought to the fore, and actually an offer of a constructive, not solution, but approach or strategy. It's beautiful. To the problem that he posed, which is that the epistemological prescriptivism and narrowness of some aspects of educational practice and process in higher education is something we need to attend to. And he was talking about gaming environments. Gamings do something different and in a different way, and maybe do some things better. And I would argue not everything. And I would also argue that the academy and the kinds of thinking and analysis we do in the academy is more relevant than ever to some of the language educational conditions that we're presented with currently. Now, you might wonder, what's this use and exchange value, this neo-Marxist standing before you, talking about things that came out a couple of hundred years ago. And the idea here is that we have a lot of focus in conventional education on exchange value. I work hard for a grade, which then I can exchange for a job, or a diploma at least, maybe not the job part in the current market. Now, what I would like to suggest is that use value, giving people affordances, frameworks, critical faculties that they can utilize and deploy in other arenas of life activity, social life, work life, various professional practices. This is something that we could do a bit better job of in the academy, and particularly within foreign language education. And this isn't a surprise to anyone, but this is something that I think bears repeating. Now, the idea of thinking about second language acquisition and L2 education involves thinking about what some of the acquisitional potentials are of different social practices. And as you know, we have a huge number of new communicative modalities, some of which we'll explore today in some detail. But if we're thinking about an individual, right? An individual actually needs to think about his or her language learning process and experiences aspects of language development across all of these different domains, right? There's the cognitive, right? Or the level of neural activation, brain activation. Very, very important, actually. You might be surprised, given I come from this quote-unquote sociocultural framework. I think about the brain all the time. I even have a publication in brain and cognition, actually, because the brain is very important to understanding developmental processes. But then you have psychological, social, cultural, environmental, and identity or performative dimensions to language learning that are also crucial. So really, the job before us is immense, huge, massive. And we need to do some critical thinking about those issues. What we're going to do today as kind of a roadmap is talk just a wee bit about digital demographics and language use through some of these new media environments that I find interesting and compelling, also problematic, and causing me great consternation at times. None of this is easy or simple. The next is I'll review a couple of theoretical orientations, one of which is cultural historical activity theory, but I want to embed that discussion in a broader discussion of what it is that we want to do as researchers and the ways in which we need to nest the individual activities that we investigate within these broader contexts. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There's a project I'm doing at the secondary school level at a local high school near where I work on instant messaging and blogs. And I will talk about, and in fact, we'll repeat some of what I presented at the beginning of the month. And it was at that point a 5 or 10 minute little case study. Now, what I've done in the interim is the second point. I, with 2 graduate students who shall be named shortly, who have been very instrumental in this process, we've actually assembled a 500,000 word corpus. And it's so neat to explore, well, what's happened? We have them using blogs, we have them using Instant Messenger, as well as some other tools, but, and we have all types of interesting phenomena to report. But does it make a difference at the level of converging on expected forms of language use and an ameliorated or enhanced capacity for expression, right? And that is what I shall relay to you for the first time in public in about 29 minutes, I'll guess. I would also like to talk, now that is what I am terming at least, a more convergent view of what we can gain in terms of language acquisition based on the use of internet communication tools, because blog environments functionally are extended writing environments. And everyone knows all about blogs. I mean, they're in the media. You probably have blogs yourself. And they privilege more or less accurate, at the level of orthography and discourse grammar, externalized accounts in writing, right? Which is just the type of thing we do in other contexts, like essays or whatever, term papers. But this notion of gaming in virtual environments, and I'd be interested to talk to you more about Second Life, they actually diverge in some significant ways from some of the norms and some of the foci that we hold dear in language education. So I'd like to talk about that as a different case. And I'll be talking about World of Warcraft. I did not choose that game at random, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to that section of the talk. All right? And I'd like to, in the end, bring to the fore not only all of what I've talked about today in a coherent pedagogical framework, but also tie in Jim G's recent talk, less so Claire Cromp's, although Claire and I had a very interesting discussion about her talk as well at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and talk about how we might wed together the divergent epistemologies and vernacular versus power language uses of language that we need to all subsume under what I will argue is the critical superordinate notion of critical language awareness, right? Meaning you need to know about language and how language is used, and then its actual instantiation and talk is secondary to that. Now, not less important, but it's the next level down, the actual use level. The awareness level is critically important. So I'll talk a bit about some digital demographics. These are all environments you're very familiar with. There's absolutely nothing new here. YouTube, massive opportunities for externalizing media that might be creative, funny, artistic, witty, expressive in some way. All types of both video and text, synchronous interaction and communication going on. Blogging environments, as we discussed, are very important. I showed this slide a couple of weeks ago when I was here. But blogs are so ingrained. You can't turn on CNN or Fox without seeing mention of blogs. In March 2003, there are virtually none. This stops in March 2007 when there are 70 million tracked, regularly updated blogs. And that's just to show you the mercurial rise of mediated communication. And I can almost promise you, though it seems impossible to imagine, that in 2002 or 2001, none of you were using the term blog. Maybe had never heard the term blog. And so this is something that we're getting more of these days. Second Life, and this picture too. And I'm going to toggle between these, not to send you into a catatonic stupor or seizure, but because they illustrate something that I think is very interesting that I'm sure will come out in the Second Life presentation and workshop in a couple of weeks' time. Second Life can be used as prosaically, but also as creatively as any other environment. And if you look at these two images, you'll see that there is an episteme in the sense of Foucault that is undergirding both of these seemingly dissimilar images. There's a single point of reference in the middle, right? It's an individual here, and it's a screen and an individual or two sitting up front here. And it's this idea of one entity organizing and controlling the actions and interactions of multiple entities, much like this interaction right here, right? Now, I'm not saying that's not good for learning, but I'm just saying many of these new environments are reproducing analog conventions, pedagogies in very specific and precise ways. I will talk a bit about World of Warcraft. It's the largest and most important and prominent of the massively multiplayer online gaming environments that are there. All types of new social media tools, etc. And many of you know this already, but we have a little bit more than 1.5 billion internet users currently. 1 in 10 individuals in the US have started a blog. 14+ million play World of Warcraft, which if you look at it in terms of populations of countries in the globe, puts it just below Burkina Faso. 90% of students at my university use Facebook and other media. 5 million new users a week on Facebook. 5 million. 5 million. And you know, who's the growth demographic? Carl, myself, Diane, Joe, you know, exactly. I mean, Rupert, we're the growth demographic. People who are 30, 35, 40 plus, yeah? Huh? So basically, you know, it's us. And this idea of social media is really important. And I turn to journalists quite often to better understand the things that I'm supposed to be focusing on for research, because they get it early, they get it often, and they put it out right away. Clive Thompson, who writes for the New York Times as well as Wired and other magazines, talk about the ways in which these new social media actually can be explained with this metaphor of museum curating. You know, you put up an exhibit, but you modify it, you tailor it, you add to it consistently. And that's a really nice descriptor, I think, for at least the way I use Facebook and seemingly others as well. So a couple of tensions. This is my Diane Schallert moment. A couple of tensions come up. I don't mean to keep teasing you, Diane, but it's a great discussion that we had together. This idea of the traditional emphases within the academy, analytic rigor, epistemological and linguistic prescriptivism. What does that mean? The fancy part at the end. There's a right and a wrong, a good and a bad. I know as the instructor, you're coming to learn what I know as students. And the idea is that there's a fairly narrow selection bias for what is counted as appropriate, good, redeemable, highly evaluated knowledge, right? And on the other side, we have this, as Colin Lancashire and Michelle Noble describe it, this open source epistemology. And what they mean by that is that there are fewer constraints, first, and that there's this more organic generation of different ways of doing things that get picked up and memed or dispersed through the population with tremendous rapidity. The academy and formal genres of writing are not as flexible or not as nimble, right? I mean, we have very consistent ways in which we use talk and writing in the academy, for example, and the way in which we expect it of students. Now, this presents to us a double-bind contradiction. As Jim talked about, Jim G., there are all these, he didn't use these terms, these are mine, but this emergent contingent logic of high-frequency digital vernaculars on the one side, and I would argue that in the academy, and I've had many, both K-12 and university foreign language instructors attend technology sessions that I've run, and they come up to me and they go, oh, see, this is so exciting, but wait, that's wrong. Oh, there's a spelling error here. Oh, look at that post-pose morphology. I'm going to kill myself if I see that again. I'm like, well, you can't do anything about that. You're going to have to accept the fact that in synchronous chat, people are not going to have the same orthographic control that they do when they're writing, then revising and revising again, some sort of extended asynchronous text, right? It's just not the same thing. So on the one side, we have the importance of these high-frequency digital vernaculars, but on the other, we have really important things we do in the academy, like the command of formal genres or power genres of language. This is critical. I want my students to have this. Now, what I got from my discussion with Diane and others is that Jim might have sort of wanted to displace some of the things we do in the academy with these other ways of doing and learning and being, and certainly his writing talks about that. And I find it to be a little bit, and I've talked to him about this in person, by the way, so I'm not telling you anything he doesn't already know that I know about his work or think about his work. The idea that we need to think about a syncretic fusion. We need to think about wedding together. We need to improve ourselves where and when we can in the academy, but we need to be able to deploy the careful kind of thinking, of analysis, of contrastive approaches to understanding difference as well as similarity that we're really good at. That's what we excel at university level work in particular. And I think that can really help us to elide this problem of digital vernaculars, their high frequency, the great pedagogy going on in gaming worlds as wonderful, and what's happening in the academy as simply problematic, antiquated, etc. I don't think it's that simple. And I think that further, we can actually do something to wed these together very powerfully. Okay. In terms of foreign language education, the take-home message for the first couple of minutes here is simply that mediated communication, using whatever communication tool, isn't a practice arena or proxy environment anymore. This is the real thing, right? Mediated communication, for many of our foreign language students in particular, is the primary modality through which they will engage in the majority of their communicative activity in whatever the target language is, unless they move somewhere where they're actually living, where the language is spoken. So we need to think about revisioning foreign language education to incorporate some of these, and maybe to make certain kinds of specific genres of language use mediated by these communication tools the goal of foreign language education. And I'm not saying throw out formal accuracy. What I'm saying is we need to include and do a better job of identifying sociolinguistically the specific qualities of what makes someone a particularly good IM communicator, or a particularly sought-after gamer in a massively multiplayer online environment, or a wonderful blogger that people return to day after day after day. What is it about those people that really stands out linguistically at the level of linguistic description that we could subsequently bring up to the level of visibility and share and potentially inculcate with students so that they can develop these same repertoires? All right. And the reason, of course, and forgive me for showing this slide again, this is my daughter at 1 year, 3 months. I mean, these kids, and she was not a particularly good typist at this point, although I do have a very large number of documents with odd characters in them from this period. Non-staged, but we do have kids growing up, and now she types now, types her name, types little stories, and this is the kind of thing that we're going to be confronted with, is kids who have a really deep sense of what it means to be literate in a variety of literacies, if I can use that redundancy. Yeah. Okay. I have a number of pubs, including a book-length treatment of sociocultural, cultural, historical approaches, and I have a bunch of this on my website if you want to see it, so you don't need to worry about scribbling frantically. But I'd like to embed the description of cultural historical approaches to thinking about learning and development in a broader framework. And I am thinking quite a bit, at least I was last night, quite late, about this notion of dialectical unities or continua, right? And rather than thinking in binary oppositions, I'm trying to think about a continua within which we can emplace human development and its assessment and potentially its inculcation or encouragement. And so one of these is simply that we have brains, but we also live in a world, right? Another is that we have individuals and we have society. And this is the driving problematic in social science research, right? Is this really complex interrelationship between people and broader cultural, historical, discursive, institutional structures, right? This is a big deal. This micro interaction, what's happening right now in this moment of engagement, and macro cultural institutional formations. Idea of local place, what's happening right here, right now, and the ways in which we actually understand, some of at least, what's happening right here, right now, through a broader understanding of cosmopolitan spaces. The ways in which we understand ourselves as distributed through activity in other parts of the world and different regions. And this idea of, actually it's kind of an orthogonal axis. We have history made present, which is culture, that we use as a set of resources from an ecological perspective to do things in the present. So we have this emergence or this notion of process, and then we also are coming out of a context that is deeply and significantly informed by the past, right? Which is very powerful, and there are many theoretical frameworks that talk about this in significant detail. And of course, one of them is this Vygotsky-Leontiev tradition of cultural historical activity theory, and Bonnie Nardi as well, who's a contemporary theorist who thinks about this in the context of technology. So one of these issues, if you're trying to understand how and why history matters, you can think about something like language, right? Language is something that we inherit. We don't, you create on a micro level and transform language through use. But we really inherit language through interaction with other people. And initially, as a language learner, you're sort of exposed to interaction. And subsequently, you begin internalizing bits and pieces of those interactions, and they in fact become resources for you to do all types of both personal cognitive work, what they call in the Vygotskian cultural historical framework private speech. And you can also use talk, of course, for social interaction. To govern request something, have someone do something for you, express yourself, engage in what's sometimes called an intersubjective plane of shared meanings, or attempt to cultivate and maintain that through interaction. And there are lots of approaches, I think, that are critical here. And I took out a couple of slides on purpose because this was getting long, but thinking about linguistic relativity in its many forms. And that is simply the ways in which language is actually deeply implicated in the ways in which we understand and construe the world, right? Without too much further ado, this is the basic model that Vygotsky was responsible for, this notion of mediated action. And if you look at the subject and the object here, the idea of people acting on the world is mediated through language, numeracy, literacies, the idea of planning, architectural designs, right? As well as physical material tools like a hammer or a bulldozer or whatever, right? You act on the world through symbolic and material means. And that this has a number of effects, one of which is that we don't need to be subject to reaction. Rather, we internalize cultural means that allow us to make decisions about what and how we react to other people and to events in the world, right? And this is a very deep notion, even though it seems rather straightforward and simple in a way. Now, if you look at this image quickly, you'll see that there's an individual acting on an object through mediational means, and there's something missing, and it's these ideas of the community that we reside in, the rules and the division of labor, or what it is that you're doing within a complex infrastructure that involves lots of people doing lots of differentiated things that need to be incorporated in this model. And that was brought to the fore in 1987, schematically anyway, by Jyri Engström, a Finnish scholar. And this is subsequently moved to thinking not about cultural arenas of human activity as independent or isolated from one another, but actually as interpenetrating with one another. So you're all here today, right? So you have some sort of academic interest, but you might not all share precisely the same academic interest. And you'll have discourses and disciplines and fields that you interact within, but yet we might share this moment here, which is the idea of some sort of invited address and a talk followed by a discussion and all these sorts of things that actually is a culturally organized system of activity that is transportable across fields. But then you might articulate what happens here back into these other organized systems of activity in ways that allow for and encourage, indeed, interpenetration. All right. I'm going to not talk too much about this, just that this framework is not only an interpretive framework, it's also a framework that can be used for innovation, for change, for transformation, right? You can understand a situation in order to make it better. And that's a really important part of activity theory. So let's try and get to some data. I know this has been kind of a long preamble. But I carried out this study. Well, first, let me say, I wanted to make better foreign language education in a local Spanish advanced placement course. And so I did that by working very closely with the instructor, Dana Weber, who had actually been in one of my graduate seminars. And she has two sections of Spanish advanced placement and then some other sections at lower levels. And so the idea was to think about, and I have it up here, we talked about this quite a bit, creating a semiotic ecology, if you will, that spanned in school communicative practices, but also out of school digital vernaculars, the ways in which the kids in her class anyway were frequently using blogs and instant messaging and these sorts of things, not related to any schoolwork necessarily, not in any formal way. And the idea was to sort of laminate these together, and I'll talk about that in just a sec. But the idea, so let me just say first about the kids too. This is a fairly affluent population, and I think it's important to know that. We're a small bounded college town, but most of the kids did have technology at home. So even though this data was gathered in 2005 and 6 that I'm going to report on today in the Corpus study, and we're doing this still today. We do this every year, and we modify it and change it every year. These kids, didn't have to look hard for or work hard for access to technology, and I think that's pretty important when you think about applying this or taking this model to other communities. So let's look quickly at the intervention. And here, I'm not using activity theory in any fancy way. I'm just saying, okay, so what do I want to get out of this experience? Well, the kids can mediate their activity, their communicative activity, through a variety of internet communication tools. So we have this idea of everyday uses of instant messenger. All of them had maxed out their buddy list, by the way. All had 200 buddies, which is the maximum number. And so they were using this tool every day, all the time. And for those of you who either have kids who use it or who use it yourself this way, although Facebook has eclipsed instant messaging in some ways, I realize that. So this is a little bit antiquated by a couple of years. But they had this very common, very fluent way of using language that they were very familiar with. Now, we wanted to have them use Spanish through this tool. And we also, many of them had blogs, personal blogs. You can't or couldn't, at that point, be a fully competent member of the high school community without some sort of web representation, usually in the form of a blog. And so we thought, you know, these are the tools we're going to try. And the idea, if you look on the division of labor side here, the idea is to sort of wed together or bring into juxtaposition their social identities as language users with their academic selves as students, right? Which is a very carefully and tightly confined subject position, if you will, to use the social theoretical term for it. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the qualitative data. It's just one screen, and then I'm going to move to some of the corpus analyses. And here you have a student saying an interview. These are all one-hour ethnographic interviews. I noticed that people sort of find their own style of writing blogs or IM, and you sort of adopt that as you go, whether it be in English or Spanish. Another student said, so you have Spanish instant messaging? Yeah. So being clever and using words well, you know how it is. You have to make up a personality using words. And you have to do that in Spanish. Now, I've taken, as a foreign language, a number of courses, right? And I never really thought about language and language learning in quite this way when I was a foreign language student, particularly at the secondary school level. I thought about memorizing vocabulary lists, getting A's. I imagined sitting across from an intrepid interlocutor and having a great conversation, although I never did that because I was in North America and the languages I was studying weren't. So here you have this idea of these kids actually displacing a focus on a particular language and saying, well, you know, the big thing is, you know, making up a personality using words, and being able to be clever and find your own style, right? English, Spanish, I mean, that's quite a remarkable statement, I think. And this really transforms, I think, what the goal of this foreign language activity is, all right? And this is just summarizing what I just said. Now, in my prior work, sort of post-dissertation on, I'd really looked a lot at the fact that kids had long histories of language socialization into digitally mediated speech communities, right, outside of school. Subsequently, they'd come into class or they'd come into a lab and they'd engage in these communicative dynamics, and they would do things. They would be people that wouldn't necessarily align with traditional notions of studentness or how students would use language in an instructional context. And there had been lots of talk about why that was. Lack of paralinguistic cues and these sorts of things. But I actually think it was simply a process of socialization. They were using a synchronous communication tool outside of school in these exogenous cultures to schooling, right? And they had become very competent, very successful, adept users of these technologies in those environments. And when they were brought into, when they were using those same tools in instructional context, well, who are you going to be? And how are you going to carry out life? What self are you going to present through language in those contexts? The one you're good at, the one you've used a lot. And it's kind of an underwhelming point now, but it was certainly a revelation to me that helped explain some of the dynamics that you have happen, or had happened in the past. And now, in this project, we're seeing all types of other dynamics. So that was a centripetal motion from acculturation into digitally mediated speech communities that had nothing with schooling in. Now, what I'm seeing in this example of these high school kids is they're doing things within school that were incited by Spanish advanced placement instruction that's percolating out into their lives as social people, not as students. And that's a critical distinction. And the things that happened were using Spanish much more than was necessary for the course, over using instant messenger. This was a fascinating issue. They actually wrote blogs in Spanish for Spanish class, liked them so much that they put them en masse in Spanish on their personal blog sites. to which their students responded, huh? You know, I mean, it was a very interesting thing. But they did this repeatedly. They also took blog posts they really liked in English that were sometimes over-personal, I would say, for inclusion in class content. And they would translate them into Spanish, not using a translator, because they felt this was really important, right? I am saying something that I find very relevant to my life, and I want to include this in the school, the blog that I'm keeping for Spanish advanced placement. Similarly, some of the things going on here, and this has been theorized quite a lot in the sociolinguistics literature. Ben Rampton, who I spent about a week with this last summer at a conference, talks about stylization a lot. And the kids would sometimes ape or mimic certain aspects of the foreign language use in a way that he talks about as forms of parody or ritual. So its acquisitional effects are hard to know, but it was something that became a currency. Right? It was a way in which they could mobilize some of these semiotic resources for purposes that weren't traditionally part of their foreign language experience. And my immediate colleague at Penn State, Suresh Kanagaraja, talks a little bit about shuttling between languages for strategic purposes. And this big idea, really, of the expanded object, as it's described in activity theory, the expanded goal of action is in this case just being a socially desirable interlocutor, being someone who would be desired in conversation. And this articulates with ideas about language learning or about learning anything, not simply as acquiring knowledge, but about becoming a different kind of person, right? Which is, I think, a much more profound way to understand development. Now, Julieta Fernandez and Aziz Yuldashev and I have been working on a data set that had not been amassed when I was here earlier, and so this is its unveiling. We talked about some of this briefly at Calico, but this is an updated version. We have about 500,000 tokens, 500,000 words that we put together in a corpus. Because if I were you, I might have thought, well, interesting, you know, that this is going on in a Spanish advanced placement course. What are they learning again? Right? You would want to know at the level of performance, at the level of linguistic externalization, if you will. What's happened here? What's changed? Right? And so this is a largely descriptive corpus linguistics study that looks at some of that data. And we try and track what's called within the Vygotskian framework the microgenesis of development, meaning how language use actually develops in real time. And we have a 38-week semester. And what we did is we put all the data together, and this is a developmental learner corpus, which means that all of the data, each individual unit of data, whether it's an IM message or a blog post or what have you, is date and time stamped. And we, just to let you know, for any of you corpus linguists out there, we went up to the level of week. So it's by week, right? So we have week 1 through week 38 of the K-12 school year. And we have data instances for many of those weeks from these students. So what you can do with corpus linguistics is you can sort of use it as a large-scale empirical approach to actually looking at language use. So the first thing we did is we looked at the most recurrent two-word chunks. We thought, well, what are students using a lot, right? And not surprisingly, they're talking about things they like. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. We went up to 3-word chunks, and we looked at the most frequent 3-word chunks in this 500,000 word corpus. And you get, again, lots of gustas. So we thought, let's look at gusta. And so we did. And Orlando or other of you who are expert in Spanish can help me, as I'm not an expert in Spanish particularly. But we found 5 different constructions of some frequency. Me gusta plus noun or noun phrase, me gusta plus noun clause, almost always coordinated with que. Me gusta plus a verb, usually in the infinitive. Me gusta plus an adverb or adverbial phrase. And a mí me gusta or a mí me gustan, right? So what we did is we actually looked at individuals who had some interesting variability. Now some students, this is an advanced placement course, so as you would expect in maybe 3rd semester university courses, some students are getting all this right away, right? they're pretty good already. Some students are really rather remedial, and some are actually showing dramatic developmental gains over time. So in this use of me gusta by week, we're looking at Benito, and this is only his blog posts. You can see basically the brighter colors, the red and the yellow, are convergent with expert speaker norms, so you have pro drop, right? The non-pro drop, so yo me gusta and yo no me gusta, are in the darker colors. And you see that while there's a movement toward greater accuracy over time, you see some of what Carl and I debated about today, which is possible free variation, lack of control over when Benito actually did or did not use or employ pro drop. In this case. And for those of you not so familiar with Spanish, you need to drop the pronoun in most cases. And there are some exceptions, right, for emphasis and things like this. But the idea of looking at a student's data here, you can actually see how things are playing out developmentally in terms of how they're using the language. Now, if you compare this to elicitation testing, what if you'd given Benito a test here, right? So week 18, that seems like a good week, right? Then if he were given an elicitation test that asked him to use gustar in 7 or 10 sentences, he may have gotten it perfectly, if this is in fact accurate indication that he used it, 4 times that week. So here, though, you start seeing this free variation, this lack of control, where he actually still uses the pronoun under conditions that didn't seem pragmatically appropriate to do so, right? So it's kind of a neat way to look at the data. Now, if you look at Isabel, you see some early free variation where she doesn't engage in pro drop. But then you see right around week 8 or 9, her usage becomes consistent with what you would expect or converges with expert speaker norms. Now, one thing you can do with corpus linguistics that's kind of fun is you can actually do concordancing lines. And Aziz insisted that I have a heartbeat throb over the key point that you were supposed to look at. But if you look now, and this is, I know, of limited interest to some of you, but if you're building a corpus, we have the week, Spanish, class 5, B for blogs, and then the topic of the class that week. So you can do a lot. So we could also build a little mini corpus by topic or by just blog posts, which this is, or you can have blog and IM posts combined together. So if you can combine the data in different sorts of ways. But if you look at this, it's right at this week 8 where she does her last little free variation, and then that's it. And if you go back and look at the histogram, whoops, other way, the histogram, you can actually see that her usage was massively variable. Whether it's free variation or not, we'd have to do a closer functional analysis. By the way, this is really, I mean, this project is quite nascent, like a couple of weeks old, right? So it's all new stuff, which is why I wanted to present it, because it's more fun to tell you about things that I'm not fully sure about yet, because maybe you'll have interesting feedback. And then it really cleans up, and you see very consistent usage over the rest of the academic year, right? So one of the things you can do here in terms of assessment, and this is second language writing assessment, is you can actually look at changes, and changes that stick, right? Or changes that are still unstuck, if you will. All right, so let's look at just a couple of more examples from the blogs. We also found Pienso que. This is the same slide I showed you before, but I've highlighted Pienso que, and I just have one example here. And this is the neat genesis of a structure, its expansion into a variety of ways. You see, Pienso que is by far the most common. And what you can see here, if you look up at the screen, is it happened in week 3, twice. Week 6, it happened once. She used it once. Week 8, 3 uses, etc. So this is a very relatively high frequency construction for her. But you have this pienso que. Then you also have pienso de or pienso del used in week 18. Pienso en, so you have this extension of the pienso into another context. And then you have this last utterance that involved pienso in a way that wasn't pienso que in week 26, which is pretty complex. Lo primero pienso cuando pienso en la primavera. The first thing I think about when I think about spring, right? So you can actually do something. You can look at an item like pienso, and then you can look at every instance produced by an individual. And you can, so I know that some of you might be like, well, isn't that kind of boring? That's what language acquisition is, pretty boring. right? You got to look at the details. And the nice thing here is you can actually see the change or the expansion in the uses of a form and their first appearance within this context using a tool like this. It's a very profound approach, I think, to second language writing assessment. Most recurrent two-word chunks, we found no say, which is not too surprising. However, when we expanded it out to three-word chunks, we found a number of problems that warranted investigation. And that was you got je ne sais, right? So, which is possible, right? I mean, you can use the pronoun for purposes of emphases and things like this. But we wanted to explore this further. And we're looking here at my Argentinian graduate student says Mayela. So, yeah, and you can say Mayela or whatever you like. But in week 3, week 4, and week 7, we have different kinds of uses. You have je ne sais, right? And then subsequently in week 4, you have no sais. So that would be a more target-like utterance. In week 7, you have je ne sais, followed by no sais, all in the same instant messaging conversation. So, and we didn't see, others of you who are more expert in, we don't have quite enough context for you, I guess, but we could not see a functional reason for this alternation. In weeks 10 and week 25, we have some other examples. In week 10, we have 2 uses of no sais, right? And in week 25, we have this really interesting thing that Wara, and I can't remember her first name now, calls a possible learner construction. You have this je ne sais, but it's in response to Guillermo asking her, you know, is it going to be difficult or easy? And this is in regard to a soccer championship game she's going to play. And what she seemed to be saying, based on the ways in which her utterance here plays out, you know, I don't know, but I think that if the team has the will, they can win, right? This idea is really aligned with maybe je que sais, which had been talked about a lot, or que sais je, you know, who knows, right? But if we have the will to, you know. So here you have this potential error, quote unquote, right? Actually either being moved toward this que sais je, you know, or not. It's a little bit hard to know, but that had been stressed in the course, and we're wondering, when you can find these things through a corpus analysis, we're wondering, you know, these might be the seeds, the germ cells, if you will, of something that grows into something more substantial. Interestingly, in week 28 and 34, we see this consolidation of no sais. We never see je ne sais again. All right? So, so it's interesting. I mean, again, you know, it might seem prosaic, but you can actually look at every single instance of a construction, and you can see what kinds of command the student has over that. So a little bit on corpus assessment of L2 writing. This is descriptive. This is obviously not a causal study. I'm not making any claims about why development occurred. But I am making very careful linguistic assessments of the fact that change is happening. Sometimes it's back and forth and erratic, but in general, we found it trending toward preferred usages. The continuing research that we have planned here is to actually apply the usage-based model of linguistics or language acquisition, pioneered early on by people like Michael Tomasello, where you look at processes of entrenchment and preemption, right? And within a context of language use, this idea of entrenchment and preemption would be the kinds of feedback you do or don't get based on usage, right? So we need to pay careful attention if we want to make correlational arguments about the kinds of things that might be associated with improved usage or more target-like usage. We need to think about those processes vis-a-vis feedback the student might be getting either from the interlocutor in these chats, which we didn't find much of, or perhaps in classroom discourse or information provided by the instructor. You probably know this from the usage-based literature, but the grammar, as Paul Hopper and others have argued, is not a precondition for language use. It's actually epiphenomenal of language use. Grammar are just sedimented practices that come to provide resources for you as a communicating being. And Tomasello talks about this as language learners, beginning with more formulaic sequences that then become what he calls low-scope patterns, right? You can infuse them, they're somewhat malleable and extensible, and eventually they become more abstract constructions, which might allow you to engage in schematization and analogy, which are the ways in which he talks about using patterns in discourse and applying them to new discourse domains with new vocabulary and constructional qualities associated with them. And there's a really great bit of work on first language acquisition that utilizes this perspective. And I think some of the critical work that we'll need to do within foreign and second language education is to begin thinking very carefully about the kinds of things that we can learn from and explain using this framework. All right, how about something fun for a minute, if that was a little too either technical or dataful. And this is short, but gaming in virtual environments are critical, I think, to understanding what's happening in everyday recreational arenas. And as you know, there's also a very large serious games initiative now, where people are trying, and Jim G is one of them, trying to take some of the pedagogy, some of the ways in which human activity is structured in these gaming environments as maybe even an ideal form of or environment for learning and development. And a couple of the different sorts of games out there, Second Life I would talk about as a persistent open space or a virtual sociality it's sometimes called. MOGs or MMOs, as Steinkuhler and others have described them, massively multiplayer online games. World of Warcraft is the best known example, and that's the one I'll talk about for just a minute. And then you have this notion of SIES, which stands for Synthetic Immersive Environment, and that is one that combines some of the dynamics possible with social virtualities with some of the goal-directed activity you find in gaming environments. Was that too much or too fast? I know I speak quickly. Yeah, so, and if you know the research on, or if you're interested in the research on the social psychology of avatar embodiment in these environments, it's really, really interesting. If you self-perceive as taller or better looking, you produce more discourse in a variety of different psycholinguistically controlled discourse tasks. And the data and of articles, it's fascinating. I really didn't want to believe it. I mean, I play avatar embodied games all the time, right? And engage in Second Life. I really didn't think, and as an introspector, I did not think that could possibly be the case. It seems to bear out in a number of tightly controlled studies. So I think that this idea of looking at the multiple stances and social identities these environments afford is very interesting. These are just some screenshots of World of Warcraft. I know the pictures are a little bit washed out here, but you can see quest text. You're given very tightly controlled tasks in the game that sort of encourage you to do certain things. Now, this very complex looking screen, which is not too clear, is just meant to show how much language or talk is going on. And there are 3 different synchronous chat channels displayed here. And this is a 20-person raid. So these are all the health bars to let you know how your collaborators are doing, if they're near death or if they're doing okay or what have you. And probably for a 20-person raid, I don't know exactly the full situation for this account, you probably had voice as well. So these are very semiotically rich environments. Any of you play World of Warcraft or any of these other games? Yeah, okay. So you know all about this. Do you use TeamSpeak and when? Exactly, right, exactly.
Yeah.
I know. Well, we've been made to be embarrassed about right? I mean, Jim G's big on this, right? Gamers are bad people, right? And you can tell me this. How many thousands of hours have you played WoW? That's right. And the reason people play this game so much is because it's so hard, right? I mean, it's not because it's a quick fix. There are no quick fixes in this game. I mean, to get up to basic levels, it's a few hundred hours, right? I mean, get up to the basic. And when you level cap out, that's when you really have to start working hard on your character development. As I see you blush again. Yes. I tell you what, we'll console one another later. But the gameplay is only part of what's going on here. World of Warcraft, for example, is available in all kinds of languages now. I think 13 or 14 different languages now. Chinese is interestingly, for those of you curious about this, Chinese language World of Warcraft players form the majority. So English is second, I think, and then a number of other languages. But so you have your gameplay, right? But then you also have all these metaplay resources like ThoughtBot or what have you that give you information about how to go about thinking about the game. And it's fascinating to look at that stuff. Constance Steinkuhler at University of Wisconsin just did a study looking at these secondary, what we call kind of tertiary discourses associated with the game. And 75% of all the posts in these threaded discussion lists illustrated not kind of, but precisely the kind of logic and rationality associated with scientific thinking. Hypothesis generation, testing, failure state, which is the way games work. Games work by pushing you to a failure state. You die, usually, and then you're reborn in WHISP form, run back to your body, and play again. And these tasks are hard, and they're supposed to be hard. That's the way you move up to another level, right? So this idea of scientific method as not being associated with these games, math, I mean, how much? Who knew we needed to know so much math to play this game, right? Yeah, it's surprising. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about one event, and this is the larger context. It's a player who's American who sent me this description of what he was doing there. He was hunting baby dragons. That's all you really need to know. When someone texted him in the game with the following message. Okay, so Zom is it turns out he's Ukrainian, not Russian, but he's using Russian. Meme is the American. And so they have this opening gambit. Now, right after this happened, Meme, these are two little activity systems for you. This is the game environment, right? System of culturally organized activity of the game. And that the other there is Meme's hometown. And in his hometown, he grew up with a Ukrainian. And he was in frequent instant messaging contact with that Ukrainian. So when he started playing with the Ukrainian in the World of Warcraft environment, he immediately kept playing and doing his stuff, but got on Instant Messenger, sent a note to his friend saying, how do I talk to this guy? What kinds of things do I say? And he started getting expressions, one of which was this, how you doing? Как дела? Нормально, right? I'm not a speaker of Russian, if that wasn't utterly obvious. And I've truncated this case study. I've published this recently, so if you want to see this case study, they engage in 150 lines of mixed language interaction, right? And it's quite extraordinary what they do in these interactions. You have this naturally occurring dialogue, right? The resources for carrying out this interaction were distributed in space, right? And they also involved the use of a couple of different internet communication tools. Jan Blomart, the sociolinguist, calls this a sociolinguistics of mobile resources, right? That you get work done through bricolage, through picking up what you need to make the action happen at a particular moment in time. And you might utilize a variety of resources from texts to other people to do that work. And look at these bottom points here. Alternations of expert status, right? Helping each other. One with getting help with English, one getting help with Russian. Explicit linguistic corrections provided by both partners. Requests for assistance, can you help me with, by both partners. Extended, if you're a conversation analyst or ethnomethodologist, extended repair sequences like, what, I don't, you know, and then they had these like long back and forth to figure out what each other were talking about. And you have this enduring social bond. Now, while I am hesitant to suggest that you would want to teach a course in World of Warcraftese, many of the dynamics in this organic interaction were precisely the kinds of things that I want to see have happen when I'm teaching a foreign language, right? I mean, these are exactly the kind of things you want in small group interaction. And if you have some doubt about the efficacy of informal play, you can look at a couple of studies that I list at the top here of participants in fan fiction communities. And that's where you take Harry Potter or a story like the Japanese manga series, Naruto or what have you. And you have kids failing high school English writing novels, full novels, like 15, 20, 30,000 word novels on the web while they fail out of school. And it's this play environment. If you look at Tyrone and Liu, they did a really interesting study on play. And I know it's in a different context, but it's a young Chinese national, recently immigrated to the US, using language with the teacher, in class with peers, and then outside on the playground. And so they looked at this young kid named Bob. They looked at his interactions with the teacher, which would be the most constraining situation. And he produced, all held for time, by the way, a quantity of 260 utterances with no complex structures at all in interaction with the teacher. With his peers in the class, he produced 10 times the quantity of discourse and a small number of complex structures. With kids on the playground, so in non-regulated, non-supervised interaction, he had doubled the quantity of talk, and he had increased the number of complexity structures significantly. And this is all looking at the interaction between what can we really count as environments that are critical to fostering conditions for language learning. I believe in formal education and instruction. I also believe in the power of play, the power of deep engagement, and the power of investedness in the social activity at hand, and the role language can play in all of those contexts. A little bit of additional information. Students at Penn State anyway, undergraduates all, are studying Chinese, Korean, and Russian to play World of Warcraft with players playing the game in those languages. Right? Now, again, this isn't about you teaching World of Warcraft to your students as a genre, right? Because it's divergent, unlike blogging environments, which I think generally are highly convergent with the kinds of literacies we would want to inculcate in the academy. But, you know, synchronous chat and WoW, a little bit more divergent. But it's a very interesting idea, and it certainly warrants further explanation. I am 5 minutes from concluding, in case any of you are getting anxious about the length of this presentation. I know we started a little late. I'm about 50 minutes. It's this idea of bridging activities, which is, what do we do to take seriously both Jim G. and Diane Shallert's views on how we think about the academy and how we think about what's going on outside of the academy in constructive, syncretic ways. And I really believe that. I believe in both environments and the power of both environments. And this idea of taking the analytic traditions of schooling and life activity and fusing them is I think, very profound. And I'd like to just mention a very simple idea, which is have students bring in texts that they are deeply invested in or care about. They may not be deeply versed in some of the digital vernaculars in the languages in which they're interested in or studying. But they might be able to find something that they would want to understand better. So they bring this in. You ask them simple questions. What's distinctive about this text? How does it compare to roughly genre equivalent texts in other languages or their native language? And very important for us, the linguistic and stylistic realization of talk, of written gestures, right? The human communicative activity is patterned, always. Labov and others have talked about this within the sociolinguistics community forever. It may be a stigmatized vernacular, or it may be one that's treated as an important power genre of communicative activity. But they are all consistently realized in patterned, recurrent ways. So the idea of having this critical language awareness as a superordinate superordinate awareness, if you are, superordinate capacity above the actual use of a particular linguistic form is, I think, really, really important. So have students do three simple things: observation and collection at the top, exploration and analysis of a new genre of communicative activity mediated by something on the internet, and then looking at the participation in those communities and the creation of communication relevant to those communities. And it's a model that we're talking a bit more about in a forthcoming publication. Since this is a touchy topic, I just wanted to have a few clarifications. This is no valorization of WoW, certainly World of Warcraft, or of internet vernaculars in any way. But I do think that the new communicative kinds of gestures that are visible there warrant careful, close, sociolinguistic, and eventually pedagogical attention. Are formal genres in written communication critically important to success in the world, right? Absolutely, of course they are. And we should expect this of our students at the level of orthographic and grammatical accuracy in genres that are conventional and have long histories. But we'll also want them to be aware of some of these other things. It also allows us, as I began talking about just a little bit with the work of Tomasello, to revision how we think about language. Not as good, bad, right, wrong, but as a patterned system and resource for carrying out communicative activity. And that the choices you make will necessarily need to align with the purpose of your communicative gesture and the community that it's meant to serve or affect, right? So this idea of thinking about usage-based approaches, about grammar and lexis as choice and resource for achieving social and informational ends is really critical. And this idea of thinking about language awareness as superordinate to mechanical accuracy is another very important dimension. Shanaz, how are you? Good. And so this is it. This is the very end. A pedagogy of adaptation, which can help us assess and selectively include new genres of communicative activity. Thinking about ways to not displace entirely what we already do in foreign language and second language education, but to make sure we do a good job of trying to include strong purpose activities, right? This idea of the teacher's role is more important than ever, I think. Because what we are doing when we're talking about moving, at least in part, away from the traditional purview of foreign language education, which is the modern standard norm of a language, we're actually putting a tremendous burden, in a way, on the instructor by saying, you got to field these new media literacies, and you yourself may not know how to do that or be participating in these communities in the language that you teach. But they may be critically important for the success of the students that you work with, even in the very near term, because of the high frequency of participation in digitally mediated environments. And this larger idea of develop critical language awareness that I hope would be able to help students as well as teachers adapt to new communication genres and tools as they emerge 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Because if you recall the blogging chart showing the mercurial rise of that mediational means, the new tools are just coming, whether it's Twitter or the next thing. And we need to decide, are we going to include those tools in the genres that they mediate, or are we going to do something else? But being able to assess what's happening at the level of linguistic realization will, I think, enable people that we work with and teach to be eventually polylingual and to be capable of utilizing new languages in new ways with new communities by attending very carefully to what's expected of them and how the community operates, which is this idea of critical language awareness, right? Okay, I'm going to stop. Thanks.
So we have time for questions or comments. Diane.
Okay, so I totally, I feel as if I have to say the comment that I wanted to say at James G's talk, which I think you have, what would I say, you made so much bigger and so much better than I was actually feeling at the time. But perhaps what I was feeling is not so much that I don't appreciate his point and your point that these different forums of discussion are wonderful venues because they're so motivationally rich for the participants, and so they create the purpose for communicating in such wonderful ways. And I think that was one of the things that he was bringing to us, and that was really wonderful. The part that I didn't like about his presentation that I spoke to you about before, and that I feel as if you're either being insincere in how you say it here, but I'm being funny here as I say that, but I don't detect in your talk is that I felt that G was, for someone who's such a hero to educators and to teacher educators, that he was sneeringly dismissive of the College of Education enterprise. So I felt that was the part that and that was actually around his talk. The main point of his talk was beautiful, and I completely agree with it. It was the around part that I felt I
In terms of teacher preparation, or
teacher preparation,
okay.
and then teachers in schools and what they have to do and what they face every day and what's going on in those schools, especially since he said at the very beginning that he doesn't go into schools and he doesn't know anything about schools.
Yeah.
So I felt as if, well, that's really not fair then. I mean, you really can't be so strongly dismissive of what teachers do and what they have to do, because that's a culture all its own, created by a society of which he is a part and he's responsible for part of it. So so that was my strong emotional response to G's point, which
Could I just I think some people were really puzzled by his talk because some teachers, I remember one teacher asked him, so what you're saying is that we should be replaced by games, we should have our students just play games. And that wasn't really his point, but I think that's what was communicated, or that's what they interpreted, that this was just take these new practices and replace what you're doing in the classroom. So what I liked about what you're doing, Steve, is the notion of bridging. And so we do still have a very important role to play.
Yeah.
But that part was really missing from his talk, I think.
It's interesting.
I'm wondering how you got the high school students to do the practice where the socialization was real. I can see where you would want to socially interact with native speakers of Spanish, but I'm really surprised that high school kids were willing to practice Spanish among themselves to the point where it became real communication. How did you jump over the top of that?
No, that's a great question. With great struggle. The beginning of the and when we get more of a corpus, we're going to try and make this public. We want to mine it for a little while and get some publications out of it, but I'll be happy to share the corpus with you. I think it will be an interesting one. So the question that everyone heard just now, especially instant messaging, the blogging environment was easier because they thought, oh, I just have to write an essay, okay. And so they started off with this rather formulaic use of the blog environment as simply a place to put an academic essay, right? The interesting thing was late in the fall term and into the spring term, they actually started doing some of these, what I'm calling these centripetal and centrifugal movements, these semiotic flows, where they took something they composed for class, but liked it so much, they posted it on their personal blog site, the one that makes them an insider in their high school social group, right? Which is unusual. And then they got some back, some posts that they had really liked, and so that was kind of neat. The IM started a little bit more jerkily, and like they'd start at the beginning and then switch to English, and they did all types of things, and they seemed to be disinvested. For whatever reason, a couple of students refused to let other students get away with that. And so some of these students would engage in IM, and what the pivotal shift is, like stepping over the threshold to more complete engagement. That's the art of pedagogy, I think, rather than something you can always count on. But and I have some interesting ethnographic interview notes from these students saying, yeah, so I actually got a lot out of interacting with student X because he wouldn't let me get away with 1 or 2 word utterances, and he was constantly pushing me to actually do this. And somehow, and we started this in 2005 and 6. We did it in 6, 7, 7, 8. And are doing it again this year. It hasn't worked out equally well every year. But there's a zeitgeist that can catch fire. And the students that really take this on seriously end up using Spanish with people who aren't taking Spanish. They use it as kind of an inside code in school, face-to-face, and they'll chat with each other in Spanish, in physics class or in math. I mean, it really became infectious for some subset of students. And I think it's one of those issues where, if you encourage them, you can't make them do it. But some will come, and if the right ones do, then it can actually meme out, right? It can actually catch fire. And I had, it probably was 2007, 2008, where it was flat. The whole year was flat. No one cared. Everyone was disinvested. So it isn't something, and I haven't figured out quite the alchemy to make it work. But I do think that it can happen. And Carl, you asked the same question about Facebook earlier in the month. If you use Facebook with students, and what a great thing. What if you could have language tabs on Facebook so that you could have a Facebook in French and German and Hindi and Urdu, And you could just toggle between them, and you might want to represent different things in different of your Facebook profiles, right? What a great idea. And it might work, but it could be that Facebook, as such an important modality for young people these days especially, you might kill it for some of them as well. So, you know, I mean, that's a really critical question. But
Did the teacher assign the IM?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, all of these are assigned topics, and you needed to IM. You know, IMs are date and time stamped, right? So you needed to IM for, I think it was 50 minutes. So I mean, which is a substantial length of time. So that was another thing they said in an interview. I never knew I could have an instant messaging conversation for an hour. It was, you know, and so they had this sense of self-efficacy that came from this. But it started slowly, in almost all cases, and in some cases, like this 2005, 2006 year, it definitely took a life of its own. And it became something that not only they were invested in for the class, and these were also AP students, right? So they're self-selected. That's important to remember. This isn't like the first 3 semesters. At Penn State, you have to take 3 semesters of foreign language at university level, right? And so, you know, those kids are taking it as a requirement. AP kids, advanced placement kids, and usually juniors or seniors, they're there because they're self-selected, right? Yeah, sure. So there's actually, I hadn't thought about that. There's probably a selection bias. I was impressed. I was very impressed. I was very impressed. Yes?
Enjoy your talk very much, and we have a lot to talk about. I would add the 2 slides that you showed of the classroom sort of environment.
Yeah.
Initial entry of educators, literally initial entry of educators in Second Life. We do a lot of what your students do. We improvise based on what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And those situations are effective for some learning environments for a little while.
Yep.
But I guarantee you the students in both of those photographs, after a short amount of time of sitting, listening to someone talk or video, they get more frustrated than they would in a real classroom.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. At least I can fidget here and check my message.
That's right.
There they are. So what we're finding and what the research is showing is actually quite aligned with some of the conclusions you draw in your talk, which is we have to, the biggest obstacle we have to overcome are our own habits, patterns of thinking about how to do class in an environment where there is no gravity and where there's no physical or geographical barriers.
Yeah.
And you can teleport and do field trips. And so we're finding that a lean toward project-based activities, demonstration activities, team projects, field trips where you build what it is that you know.
Yep.
This you some people were earlier, has become more engaged, much more engaged. So you will find classroom, you can take pictures now, where you actually couldn't take a picture in the classroom. Because one team is over at NASA, another team is at the Sistine Chapel, and another team is in a sandbox building a model of their conversation. Yeah. So we're learning.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the other thing you can do on something like a virtual sociality like Second Life, you can, and I do this in my grad seminars with teach professional development. They can go in to Japanese or French or Spanish-speaking areas of the world, and they can be virtual ethnographers. They can hang out, and they can be rejected and denied interactional opportunities, just like in real life. That's what I tell you know, because you somehow think, oh, it's Second Life. I can just go on in, and people are going to want to talk to me. I'm in a great-looking avatar. It's like not so much, actually. Just like real life. No one has to like you. No one has to like you. Yeah, exactly. And then everyone's there to exactly right. No, it's true. Anyone who's spent much time in Second Life, this is what you see in Second Life. You know? Yeah. I mean, do you not? This is not a joke that works. No. You can dance in Second Life automatedly. Anyway. But yeah, no, that's a great point. And you know, there is so much potential here, especially when you start getting from pedagogy to some of the social psychological research. Carl and I have been talking about a bit on avatar embodiment and its potential impact on what you can and would want to do as a communicating being if you believe that use is important. Like this is Meryl Swain stuff, right? Communicative output is necessary for you to start doing syntactic sorts of processing as opposed to semantic level processing, right? You need to use language to learn some aspects of language use. I know that's a Department of Redundancy department, but it's critical. Is there a question? No, sorry. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.